Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, President of AG Financial Insurance Solutions. Welcome to Risk Management Live. We once again have Rich Hammar, renowned attorney, author, sailor, diesel mechanic with us. And we're just glad to have you here, Rich. And boy, when we were looking at what to do this month, some headlines showed up and we said, how to keep out of the headlines, how to keep your church out of the headlines. And so many churches are negatively impacted by the headlines. Let's just talk about the case that we saw in the newspaper and what people can do or what churches can do to keep their name out of those headlines.
Well, and Jerry, let me say at the outset, there are many times you want your name to be in the paper, your church, because churches are engaged, so many of them, in a number of community outreach programs that really benefit the community, and oftentimes those are described in the media, on the 6 o'clock news or in the newspaper, and that's wonderful. You want that kind of publicity, but we're focusing today on the other side, the negative publicity that can just stigmatize a church for generations. I know in the community where I grew up, that's exactly what happened. There was a church where some children had been molested. I mean, it must have been 50 or 60 years before, and people still associated that church with that. That's what we're talking about today, how to stay out of the headlines in terms of the negative portrayal of the church. And what caught my attention the other day was a newspaper headline, and it was on the internet as well. Texas church hires man accused of 29 counts of sex abuse. And I looked at that. I mean, can you think of a headline that would be worse? That's toxic for that church. I mean, how are they going to outlive that? So that's what we're talking about today, how to keep the church out of negative headlines. And I think there are probably three ways. When you think about this, Jerry, what are some ways that a church can be portrayed negatively in the media? And I would say there are probably many ways that this can happen. But the three ways we're going to focus on today briefly would be those sexual abuse cases that has the highest currency, I think, in terms of negativity. The public is just outraged. They're incredulous that this kind of thing can continue to happen despite all the publicity that we've had over the last few decades, that churches still see these events unfold. So we're going to talk about that. And I think a second way churches find themselves negatively portrayed in the media would be financial irregularities or improprieties. How many cases have we seen of embezzlement in the media? And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about excess benefits that are provided to typically the lead pastor and how that can negatively be portrayed in the media. And then I think another category of negative headlines would be what I would just call catastrophic injuries. And they can occur in a number of ways. It may be a drowning at a youth event, but a lot of times they involve vehicle accidents and particularly 15-passenger van rollovers. Because you're dealing with multiple victims typically. You got 15, 16, 17 kids in the van. If it's a youth event, sometimes they're children. But when there's a rollover, there can be multiple fatalities or injuries, and that's what really, I think, makes these dramatically portrayed in the media. So those are three of the ways, I think, that we see negative headlines involving churches.
What's interesting is that if your church makes the headlines one time, it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving, in that a lot of times it'll take 2, 3, 5 years for a case to actually be settled. And every time it comes back up, your name is back in those headlines again. So, you could still be paying a price for something that happened 5 years ago because the case is just now finally being settled.
That's true, because you've got, when you're talking about sex abuse cases, you're talking about a criminal component, which typically precedes the civil lawsuits, and the criminal can take a year or two, sometimes longer, for that to unfold, for the person to be prosecuted, convicted. And we've seen this happen in some cases where this can go on for an extended, protracted period of time. And so then you have all the appeals. So eventually, it may be 2 or 3 years later that the civil lawsuit is brought, and that can go on for years. So it's just the drip, drip, drip of the church being associated with those. So that's exactly right. That compounds the problem.
You know, one of the other things that I see happening with these churches that churches really don't think about is that not only do you have this horrific incident that happened, whether it be an injury from a van, 15-passenger van, or sexual abuse or a drowning, you've got the reputation of the church that's going to pay a price for a long time also. And so what happens today, this affects, the news media affects you, but a lot of people don't really think of the negative repercussions of this publicity affecting them for years and years.
It's reputational, and it does. It persists for generations. I've seen it happen. That's the church that people will drive by in your community and say for generations to come, that's the church where those kids were molested. It's almost impossible to outlive that stigma. And so that's what we're talking about today. How do you prevent your church from being in the headlines for some negative story like this? And at the top of the list would be these child abuse cases. So, you know, in this sense, Jerry, we can't talk about eliminating the risk unless you want to put a sign above the church door, no minors allowed. Then we're talking about risk elimination. But short of that, we're talking about risk management. And so the point is not how do we eliminate the risk, but how do we manage it in a reasonable way? You know, the courts are not going to hold you as a church to a standard of a guarantor of the safety of people in your church, whether they be minors or adults, whether you're looking at sexual offenses, accidents, injuries of various kinds. Whether the church is liable in a civil lawsuit in any of these cases involving personal injury comes down typically to the issue of negligence. That's the most common basis of church liability in all these cases. You were negligent in selecting this worker, in supervising this worker, in retaining this worker, negligent in supervising this event. So the concept of negligence, I think it's important to understand legally. It just simply means carelessness or falling below the standard, the community standard of reasonable care under similar circumstances. So what is the community standard? And when we look at these sex abuse cases, the community standard has changed dramatically over the last decade. And we see today, when you look in your community, the community standard for the selection of youth workers, for example, how do you find that out? You look at other churches, you look at youth-serving charities, and you look at the public schools. And the fact is that the overwhelming majority of these youth-serving charities, government and non-governmental, do criminal records checks now. So that's why over the last year or so, I've added that as not just something to consider doing, but I think as part of what I call a 6-step basic plan in reducing the risk of child sexual abuse in your church. So let me focus on those 6 briefly. And we've advocated these for many, many years. But what's different, Jerry, is I've added criminal records checks to number 6 on the list, whereas that used to be one of a number of suggestions. Now I think it's got to be incorporated into, and why do I say that? Because the community standard requires it in most cases, and I think also because they're inexpensive and they're readily accessible. So you can't argue that they're too expensive for us to do. So the 6-step basic plan would be, number 1, having a written application that everybody that wants to work with minors in your church completes. And number 2, that you do an interview with this person, unless it's somebody that's been raised in your church. But if it's not, you know, you need to get to know this person and find out why do you have this interest in working with children or youth in our church? Where have you worked with minors before? It's a very important question, because that leads to the 3rd component, and that's doing reference checks. And we've said this before in this broadcast, but it bears repeating. Getting references from 2 or 3 people that are unknown to you, that may live in different states, are essentially worthless. I think back to the FBI profile on what they call preferential child molesters. We call them pedophiles. And in that profile, one of the characteristics of pedophiles, or preferential child molesters, is that their only friends, their only adult friends tend to be other pedophiles. So getting reference, they're always able to get references from people in different states that you don't know. And you see what I mean? That becomes dangerous. And so we recommend institutional references. That means, where have you worked with minors in the past? It's common for somebody to say, well, I've worked in other churches, or I've been a teacher in a school, or I've worked as a coach, or in a host of youth-serving charities that exist in your community. And so it's important to get references from as many of those as possible that have literally observed this person working, interacting with minors. And for those entities to say, we know of no reason why this person would be a risk of harm to minors, why this person would be unfit or unsuitable to work with minors, in my opinion, that's the gold standard. That's the best evidence, that's the most effective step you can take to reduce the risk. Criminal records checks are important, as I'll share in a minute, but most sex offenders do not have criminal records. Most pedophiles don't have criminal records. And so it's dangerous. And some churches think that all they have to do is the criminal records check, and that covers everything. And that is absolutely not the case. They have to be done in conjunction with these other recommendations. And so I think getting these institutional reference checks, that's probably the most important thing we'll communicate today. Don't rely on personal references from people you don't know. Now, there always will be that person that wants to work with minors in your church who perhaps maybe has no background. You know, everybody has to start somewhere. But there, you're left with personal references, but I recommend they be members of your church. So they're people that are known to you, that can give a reference or a recommendation as to this person, to the best of their knowledge, this person's suitability to work with minors in your church. So that's the third component of risk management, and that's the institutional reference check. Number 4 is what I call the 6-month rule, which is a rule I adopted many years ago. And that it simply says this, that no volunteer will be used in this church in any capacity involving minors who has not been a member of the church for 6 months. And I have churches complain about this. Well, why can't we just have them attend for 6 months, or just maybe how about 1 month? And the point is, you can do any of the above. But the question is, when you're looking at the community standard, what steps can we take to reduce this risk? And the more you get to know this person, the less likely it is you're going to be viewed as having been negligent. Certainly you don't want to hire some guy off the street in a trench coat with sunglasses that wants to work with children. None of us, I hope, would do that. Some churches would say, oh, this is an answer to our prayer. We need more children's workers. So can you start tonight? So that's the thing we're trying to move away from. And then a 5th recommendation is the 2-adult rule. And that simply says we don't allow one child to be alone with one adult. You got to be careful here. Some churches go overboard and say, never can there be one or more children in the presence of one adult. That's going too far. You look at your public school down the street and walk into a 4th grade classroom, what do you see? Typically one teacher, 30 or 40 students, and that's it. So the 2-adult rule is not exercised by most public schools, and that's the state standard. So you have to be careful or not to go overboard. I'm not opposed to having 2 adults at all times, but if it's not workable, if there are going to be gaps in your enforcement of your policy, that puts you in the worst conceivable position. So that's the 5th. And then the 6th, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program today, the 6th step is the criminal records check, the criminal background check. And typically that's going to include a nationwide sex offender registry search. The last thing you want is to have a registered sex offender, and this happens all the time, just like the 29 counts of child abuse case that I mentioned a moment ago. The last thing you want to have happen is for a registered sex offender to be working with children in your church. So you need to do a sex offender registry search, not just for your state, but for the U.S. and you need to do a national criminal file. Those two components are typically packaged together, and they're relatively inexpensive. You're talking under $10 for most services today to get those. So that's something that we recommend.
You know, with doing those 6 things, as court cases have came up, we've actually put more emphasis like on the reference checks because of the large church that we did a case on, or a risk management live on a few months ago, where they did not do reference checks, and the court held them responsible because they did not do reference checks.
Although they did criminal records checks.
So reference checks are very important. We also had a school in California where they didn't do background checks on persons that had keys to the building. Mm-hmm. So we added background checks to anybody that has keys to the building. So as court cases get decided, we actually change or update basically the requirements that we ask our churches to do to help protect children because the community standard is changing. Mm-hmm. One of the other things is, having 2 adults, if you can have your Sunday school operate with a husband-wife team, number one, it shows a husband and wife together, family unit together. It seems to work out the best if that is a possibility where you can get a husband and wife team working a room full of kids together at the same time. It's a great way to do, to have 2 adults in one room.
Mm-hmm. I'm often asked that question, and some people suggest, doesn't that increase the risk having a husband and wife working with children together? And yes, it does to a small degree, but you have the offsetting factor that you mentioned, Jerry, of presenting to the kids a model of marriage, a husband and wife. And I think that's a powerful message that it's a powerful form of mentoring that you can do for children. And so I think that takes priority over the minimal risk. As long as you're doing your proper investigation into the fitness of these people, the incremental risk you've got from using a married couple, I think is the type of risk that should not preclude you from using that married couple.
And the other thing too is if you have a rule, no one child with one adult, even if it's a married couple, you don't let one of them take one away. I mean, if you're following the 2 adult rule, that should help suffice where you don't have an issue, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. And it is possible, of course, that let's say a wife would cover for her pedophile husband. So there is that risk, undeniably. But I think that risk is offset by the value of having a husband and wife Christian marriage presented to these kids, especially in the context of you having done adequate background checks with regard to the 6-step plan that we've just mentioned with respect to each of those spouses. And of course, if there's any suggestion of inappropriate activity, you immediately get on top of that and make a decision as to what to do.
Well, let's look at other incidences where churches have been negatively impacted, like having financial impropriety at the church and embezzlement. It seems like, we mentioned embezzlements because they're becoming a lot more prolific in the newspaper, where you see millions of dollars stolen from a church or misappropriated at a church. What are some ways that we can do to have a church not get that in the headlines?
And that very likely will be in the headlines because, again, I remember a line from Dostoevsky that the world loves to see the downfall of the righteous. So the media is on top of these problems and will often give them great emphasis in the media, whether it be television or the print media. And so I think when you're looking at these embezzlement cases, and I've seen some of these, Jerry, like you say, in the millions of dollars, it's common to see them in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. What do you do about that? And I can say this, that the vast majority of these cases are based on one defect, and that's the failure of the church to implement sound strategies or sound principles of internal control. proper safeguarding of your assets and cash handling. And so I think the best advice I could give here to protect against this type of wrong that's going to be publicized in the media. And by the way, what does that do? It causes members to be bewildered. All the money we've given to this church some of my offerings to my church have been confiscated by some treasurer or whatever, and it being used embezzled by that individual. It shakes the church in terms of the members' confidence in the financial structure of the church, and it often dampens charitable giving. People are less likely to give to the church when they see there's been such irresponsibility in handling cash by the church and offerings. So I think one of the best pieces of advice we could give to manage this risk and reduce this risk is to have a CPA audit your financial statements every year. I don't mean limited engagements like a review or compilation. I mean an audit. Because what that does, it provides a high level of confidence in the financial integrity of the church. And beyond that, it results in what is called a management letter. Now, that's a letter that the CPA firm will give your church at the conclusion of the audit. And they will list and identify areas of weakness in your internal control, maybe the collection of offerings, the reconciliation of bank statements, the deposit of the offerings. There's many ways, the counting of the offerings. There's many ways where there can be problems in the church's internal controls, and this is what causes embezzlement. And the CPA firm can zero in on those deficiencies and make specific recommendations. The board of the church then responds to those deficiencies in response to the management letter. And over time, what you can see happen is that the financial integrity of the church is strengthened, and the chances of people engaging this type of behavior, it's not eliminated, but it's greatly reduced. And so that's another example, I think, of a risk that can, of the church being negatively portrayed in the headlines, that can be substantially lowered. And the problem is, in almost all of these cases, is just very weak internal controls. And when you look at how the church has handled finances, it's shocking at how lax the church was in allowing this. There was one study, I'll never forget, that was done years ago, where the conclusion was that embezzlement is not caused so much by a need for money by the embezzler, but rather by continual non-accountable access to funds. So just that constant access to funds in an atmosphere of complete lack of accountability, that can be a powerful incentive or motivation for someone who might not be otherwise inclined to embezzle money from the church. So you want to remove that. So there's no possibility that this can happen. And so that's, I think, some very important things. A related financial irregularity or impropriety that I want to mention briefly is the concept of excess benefits. And nothing gets the public riled up more than finding that a pastor is making, some exorbitant amount of income. And the tax code does impose penalties on any tax-exempt organization, including churches, that in fact pays excess compensation to what's called a disqualified person. It can actually be anybody in the church, any staff member. So what can happen here is the loss of the church's tax exemption. Now that's rare. It doesn't happen often that a church or other charity has its tax exempt status revoked because of excess compensation paid to a staff member, but it's a possibility. Much more likely is an excise tax called an excess benefit transaction tax, or an intermediate sanction that the IRS can assess against a board member or a relative of a board member or officer of the church, typically the lead pastor, sometimes others, for receiving an excess benefit, be that an excessive salary. But 10 years ago, the IRS ruled that the concept of excess benefits can also apply to any fringe benefit paid to a disqualified person, which is generally an officer or director or relative, that is not reported as taxable income by the church. So, this happens all the time. I know in my annual church and clergy tax guide, I list 24 types of income for churches to be aware of, taxable income. And any one of those, it's common for churches not to understand many of these represent taxable benefits. And for the church not to report taxable benefits as taxable income can result in these excess benefit transaction penalties being assessed. So it's extremely important that churches understand that. Let me give you an example. It's common for churches to have a car allowance for their lead pastor. Let's say you pay $400 a month as a car allowance. So at the end of the year, the pastor's had, let's round it up to $5,000, $4,800, $5,000 in allowances for the year. And the church treasurer, maybe new in the job, says, well, I know the pastor had car expenses of at least that, so I'm not going to report this as taxable income. Bang! You've got a non-accountable reimbursement, which is a taxable fringe benefit that was not reported as taxable income. That potentially can generate, not against the church, but against the pastor, an excise benefit tax of 225% of the amount of the unreported income. 225% times 5,000 is $11,250. And so there's a penalty that the pastor is subject to for a seemingly innocuous, innocent mistake. And members of the church board can also be assessed a lower tax of 10% of the amount of the excess benefit, up to $20,000 total. So here again, it's another reason why I think in terms of risk management, and that's what we're talking about today, the best thing you can do is have a CPA audit your church's financial statements, not a limited engagement, but a full-fledged audit that can inquire into these issues to make sure your church does in fact have the financial integrity that the members of the church expect it to have.
One of the things that we have available on our website is a list of the internal controls. CPA doing an audit is number one on that list, but for a complete list of what your church can do to protect itself from an embezzlement or from financial impropriety is actually on AG Financial's website. So if you need more information in regards to that, go to the website and it's there.
Jerry, as in our last few minutes here, I wanted you to address an issue that is very important, and that is, let's say your church has had some type of injury, or and you're contacted by the media. Maybe it's a reporter for the TV station in the parking lot holding microphones up to people. It's kind of a worst case scenario. Or maybe they call the pastor. What about this, pastor? There's a lawsuit been filed against the church for child molestation. Do we say no comment? I mean, how should, give some pointers on responding to these inquiries.
And that is a great question. I have this asked all too often. But number one, it's great for your church to have a designated spokesperson to take care of these situations. So everybody knows that this person is the person to do it. The second thing I would say is that this person actually practices what he's going to say before the reporter actually gets there. So no matter what questions asked, there's 4 answers to their questions. We had an incident. The incident is currently under investigation. We don't have all the details at this time, and we are now and always will cooperate with authorities. You never say no comment. You don't lie or mislead. They only want 30 seconds, so you always remember that they just want 30 seconds worth of time. So no matter what questions they ask, you already have the answers now. And then you don't have to answer the specific question that is asked. So a lot of times they're going to say, boy, your church has been a model in this neighborhood, in this city. How could you let this happen? And instead of answering how you let it happen, you go back with those 4 answers. It cuts them off and cuts them to the knees. A lot of people get wrapped up with feeling that they have to answer the question that's asked, and that is actually, look at our politicians. They never answer the questions.
Look at the presidential debates. Who cares what the question is? Here's my... But those are good points. And I would add this point. This is a rare opportunity for you as a church to speak to your community and through media. And if you have done the 6-step checklist that we've advocated, with regard to protection of children, mention that. We take this, if there's a case of alleged child abuse in your church and there's a lawsuit, to put it in the positive that here are the steps that we take to address this risk, and we're proactive, and it can kind of tilt things in your favor. And of course, I would also recommend, and I think you would agree, any communication to the media should be reviewed by legal counsel to make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to compromise your position in future litigation.
Absolutely. Well, Rich, again, wow, this time period just went really, really quick. We appreciate you watching Risk Management Live, and we'll see you for the next Risk Management Live. Rich, thanks so much.
Thanks, Jerry.